So now we're beginning chapter 17, which is the United States actually entering into World War II and what happens with the country during the conflict. So Americans are going to join the war effort. The Selective Service Act had over 10 million men drafted through that, and over 5 million men volunteered for military service over the course of World War II. And most of the soldiers and men who join the Army would get the nickname GI, and that stands for General Issue. Again, a play on the idea of what all the different stuff that different soldiers would be given to all the different servicemen from there. And that was just one way that the American government expanded the military. The Army Chief General Staff was George Marshall, and he was the highest ranking American military man in the country. He pushed to open up the armed services to women as well, and he began with the formation of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, WAAC, or the WACs. And so on May 15th, 1942, this law was put into place. The WACs were given official status and salary as members of the armed forces. However, they were denied benefits of male soldiers as a form of discrimination against the women at the time. In July of 1943, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps was changed to the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, and at that point, they were granted full benefits, just like the American male service members as well. What did they do? They worked as nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, electricians, and pilots. Any jobs to be able that could be opened up so that the men could be moved to actually in harm's way in the fighting forces, and the women were doing a lot of the logistical and moving stuff around from there. If you think about women pilots, the planes that are being made in Detroit, Michigan, aren't going to be able to shoot any Japanese or Germans in Detroit. And so it would be the women who would fly these planes to either the coast or then overseas eventually be able to drop off there and then go from there. So that's how some of the women served. There is just one different example. It might not be an obvious one. So we touching on what we finished up with our last chapter with the idea of what's going to drive a lot of the service men and women volunteering, and again is the idea of Pearl Harbor. Any movie or any documentary you see that talks about the beginning of the war, this becomes a seminal event in American history. A lot of people are really spurred um, action based on the actions of the Japanese. And so not only men, right, sign up to go to the army, but women in the United States are also doing their part by signing up for the WAAC and later the WAC. And so again, putting on the idea that it's a women's war as well, and women, just like men, want to do their part for their country. And so they did it different ways, as you can see, working as clerical uh, uh, clerical jobs in the motor pool, fixing cars as operators and as pilots. And as we talk about ferrying some of these planes out there, and that's what they're doing within the military. Again, be able to provide some services to help free up some of the American servicemen in order to be able to actually participate in the combat flying from there. So it wasn't just the Army that also received women, that it was also the Air Force and then the waves as well for the Navy. So lots of different ways for women to serve in the Army other than just joining um, as nurses or other stuff. We see as a kind of a running theme throughout U.S. history here discrimination in serving in the armed forces as well. Minority groups in the United States questioned whether this was their fight. We've seen how the United States has been pretty racist up through this point. And so a lot of people, even including African Americans, were saying if we're not going to get the same freedoms in our own country, why should we go fight for other people's freedoms in another country? There was a lot of debate back and forth about this, but in the end, we do see dramatic contributions to the war effort from minority groups within the United States. Over 300,000 Mexican Americans joined the armed forces, over a million African Americans joined the armed forces, and unfortunately, they have like a carryover from World War I and other previous engagements. They were forced to serve in segregated units, and a lot of them were mostly limited to non-combatant roles. Um, and later on, before finally being put into combat roles, a lot of logistical stuff. You can think about like the Red Ball Express driving supplies when they finally invade Europe. Before being from there, also have Chinese, Japanese, Native Americans, and other minority groups serving with distinction with the American forces overseas. So again, this is still only the 1940s in U.S. history, so it's still pretty racist all across the board, and so we see discrimination for and against the people in the armed forces of different colors. And so you can see here that even you have segregated showers. We have people serving with distinction as well. And so you have Latin American soldiers, you have African American soldiers, again, serving in non-combatant roles, but also in combat roles. The most famous example being the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of airmen who trained and then were eventually sent overseas and became famous for flying as fighter escorts on the American and British bombers going into Germany in the European theater operation. We just get a couple examples of pictures of the airmen there. We also have African American soldiers serving a lot behind the lines as in artillery operations, of being able to load up big giant shells and shooting big guns over the attacking that way, along with other combatant roles. Another famous group of minorities that served in the United States were the Native Americans, including the Navajo code talkers, and the Native Americans using their own native language, Navajo, were able to use this as a form of a secret code to be able to talk amongst each other that the Japanese never really could or ever did crack, and that provided a lot of help in the Pacific theater of operations in order to be able to help um, fighting and against the Japanese there. And again, there's a page movie about that, those guys, and including dogs, Americans' dogs as well, also signed up to do their duty to join up to see if they can be helpful in the armed forces as well. The major thing that we talked about in the last chapter was the decision for the United States to become the great arsenal of democracy. So we see a literal production miracle occur of the United States moving out of the Great Depression into World War II with an industrial output that really has been unparalleled and unequaled over the course of in world history. So factories were able to be quickly converted over to war products, and that really helped everything out there. So two major examples include the Kaiser shipyards out of Richmond, California, and they were able to make what were called Liberty ships. Basically, you have all these German submarines and in the Pacific, Japanese submarines patrolling the oceans and blowing up any cargo intended for the Allied forces. You want to be able to make ships to be able to easily replace them, and the Kaiser shipyards would make Liberty ships in order to be able to do this. In a publicity stunt, the Kaiser shipyards actually, in just over 4 days, built a cargo ship from I mean, literal ground up from there. And so a lot of what they were doing in the Kaiser shipyards to build these was techniques from other industries, but really put into a big, huge, giant, large scale facility. And so they worked a lot with prefabricated parts instead of how people have been building ships since time immemorial of laying down the keel and working your way up. I mean, you're almost building these in almost giant sections. If you kind of know how cruise ships are built today, where they're almost big giant Lego blocks and putting them together, you're building literal decks off off water and then placing them on the ship as they were from there. And workers were encouraged to work quickly in the Kaiser shipyards as well. The major innovation also was a movement away from riveting the ships together with metal rivets to welding them together, which got a lot of flack from naval architects, but held up for the most part as they tried to slapdash together. And by switching to welding, that opened up a lot of jobs for women in these shipyards, and it's estimated that over 40% of the welders working in the Kaiser shipyards were women from there. Henry Ford, not to be outdone, in out of the Michigan prairie, built the Willow Run production factory, which was able to produce a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes in the, at the time, largest indoor building in the world. It was the largest space under one roof ever built. And that was used in Detroit, Michigan to put out a B-24 bomber, right, from the pretty quickly. And so not only do you have all of these Americans joining the armed forces, but you also have a lot of Americans joining to help the war in other different ways. So by 1944, despite the draft that had been sucking off people into the armed forces. 18 million workers were in the war industries. That was nearly three times as much as in 1941. So you have basically in the entire economy, the entire population helping at the war effort in a lot of different ways. So here's an example of the Kaiser shipyards. And what we can see again is one, just the scale of what we're working at. You have these big giant cranes who are lifting off prefabricated parts. So the other sections of the boat that can be built off the side of the boat, not on the water, are put together. Then these giant cranes lift them up and put them on the ships. And they're able to do this pretty quickly. And as you can kind of see, it's kind of built up in section by section by section. And again, about 100 days for the most part, and it kind of worked its way down, which is pretty incredible from there. And again, working nonstop, 24 hours a day in a total publicity stunt, so not anything there, but just to give an example of how quickly they were put together, is that again, just over 4 days, they were able to slapdash and put this together. And so I love this slide because it really just goes and shows by the numbers what America is doing. When we say America is becoming the arsenal of democracy, this is what it's doing in comparison to what other countries are doing. At the end of the war, America had produced over 299,293 aircraft. Japan, over the same time, only produced 70,000. It, it made 1,556 naval vessels, 5,777 merchant ships, 634,569 feet, 88,410 tanks compared to Germany's 44,000 over the same time period, 6.5 million rifles, 2,383,311 trucks, 40 billion with a B bullets. So this is the Willow Run Ford factory. And so again, what it's doing is it's going to produce nearly 9,000 B-24s over the course of the war, 12,692 B-17s, and nearly 3,763 B-29s, which are all coming from there. It was a L-shaped 67-acre building was the size of the building that is from here. And so again, we're talking about a huge, big, giant thing that was a bunch of parts on one end. They kind of looped all the way around, and then E-24s were coming off from there, right? One odd visitor found it impossible in words to convey the feel and smell and tension of Willow Run under full headway. The roar of the machinery, the special din of the riveting gun absolutely deafening nearby, the throbbing crash of giant metal presses, the far-reaching line of half-born skyships growing wings under swarms of workers, and the restless cranes swooping overhead. Um, the Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, said if the Germans and Japanese could go and see this, they'd blow their brains out because there'd be no possible way for them to understand just how many people are going from there. Tens of thousands of workers were in there. Um, Being able to go from their 40,000 men and women at its height, including little people, to be able to work inside the small spaces in the wings and other spaces of the people, like be able to build all these different ones. Right. So again, we're talking about a huge, major accomplishment in not just terms of airplanes, but also in terms of tanks and other stuff. And again, these pictures here are from the end of the war, but just give you some small little semblance of just how much stuff the Americans are making. You're making all this stuff, well, then you have to make sure that the Japanese don't bomb it. So here in California, this Boeing factory looks from the air all right and ready to be able to go and be have drums bopped on it. But the United States had entire sections and people's jobs it was in order to be able to hide the factory. And so what you're seeing here is what looks like an ideal American town, which is actually a tarp, right? Which is all fake with little stuff to be able to pop up and move trucks. Inflatable trucks is actually moved around during the daytime. So if anybody was looking overhead, they'd actually go and see how that was changing from there. That's again just a small, tiny little thing from there. So over 6 million new workers joining the labor effort were women, and we see a major introduction of women in the workforce for there. Now, there's a specific reason why the employers like to hire women because they could pay them less as a man. They could pay them 60 cents on the dollar to what a man would earn for doing the exact same job. So that's one of the reasons why employers like them. They work just as much work done, pay them a lot less, again, owing to the discrimination against women at the time. So that's one thing they have over there. We see over 2 million minority workers hired during the war as well. At the start of the war, defense contractors refused to hire a lot of them. And even if they did hire them, their work were limited to menial jobs, your janitors, or your other stuff of that nature, not doing a whole lot from there. And so, obviously, as you probably can understand, there's Americans who want to do their part, and more importantly, Americans who want to earn a decent living. And so, A. Philip Randolph, the nation's most respected African labor leader, was upset about this, and he began to call for a march on Washington in order to be able to rectify this problem. President Roosevelt, understandably, doesn't want a major march calling right in the middle of the kind of the war effort from this. And so Roosevelt sits down with Randolph, and in exchange for calling off the March on Washington, Roosevelt issues an executive order that made it illegal to discriminate against workers in defense industries. So we begin to see a slow movement of the federal government doing what it promised to do, like in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to be able to protect the individual rights of Americans and American citizens in the United States. So we're actually starting to see it for the very first time, very slowly begin to do that. Just in defense industry, though. So it's still legal to discriminate against people in other industries, but if you're making stuff solely for the defense of the United States, if you're something for the war effort, it's now illegal to discriminate the workers. And so we begin to see small gains for minorities in the United States in terms of anti-discrimination. So again, more stuff that we're just going to show you, people painting actual planes, putting stuff together, making maps for intelligence to be able to help soldiers out in that way. Again, the famous idea of Rosie the Riveter, of welding and putting stuff together, and you might recognize the famous face in the bottom right there, even including people like Marilyn Monroe got into the war effort by helping and doing stuff that way. So a lot of different stuff from there. Again, be able to putting all these things together as they're going about and doing all this different stuff. And even the Walt Disney Company is putting Donald Duck to work, going and showing stuff like you need to be able to have a good breakfast in order to be able to not only just a good student, but also be able to build stuff to beat the Nazis. And there's A. Philip Randolph as he's trying to make sure that all Americans are being able to get a fair shake at doing work for the United States of America. We don't just see a mobilization of labor and of people for the war effort, but we also see a mobilization of scientists. In 1941, the Office of Scientific Research and Development was created, the OSRD. And what this did was come up with a bunch of different um, scientific advancements and technologies throughout the war. It created radar and sonar, radar using radio waves to be able to bounce uh, electromagnetic waves off different things and have it come back and then be able to see there. Sonar doing the same thing with sound waves in order to detect stuff through water. We've come up with the creation of DDT to fight insects to be able to help soldiers survive in insect places, especially in the Pacific. This is going to have a long-term effect on the environment later on. We see the creation of the drug penicillin. It's for the first time in World War II, we begin to see soldiers dying more from wounds suffered on the battle more than anything else, because by this point, medicine has advanced to where if you get shot and are able to receive kind of care within what they call the golden hour, the first couple of first hour of treatment, you have a pretty higher survival rate because no longer you're going to be dying from infections or the actual care the doctors are trying to prevent there. And that's through drugs like penicillin to help fight against bacteria. You see the creation of targeting computers to be able to know how they're going to drop big giant shells or other stuff, be able to do these complex calculations quickly and be able to put these into guns to be able to blow stuff up more accurately. We see the creation of the proximity burst shell, which is vitally important, particularly against the airplanes in the Pacific with the Japanese, and then eventually overseas from there. What this would do, normally, if you're on the ground trying to shoot at an airplane, you would have to guess where you want your shell to go off at. Is that airplane, which looking at, is it at 10,000 feet? Is that 20,000 feet? Is it 30,000 feet? And that's really a big difference between that. It's tens of thousands of feet. And so if your shell bursts at 10,000 feet and the airplane's at 5,000, it's not going to do anything. And so it's a waste, and you're trying to limit that. And so what this was actually a shell that had a fuse in it that would detect when it was close to a airplane and only then explode, so that you're kind of able to do one less guesswork on the ground and two, be able to do that. And the Americans really claim that this was a major innovation that was very helpful throughout the war. The biggest one that we'll talk about mobilizing scientists for the war effort is the atomic bomb. This begins on October 11th, 1939. So hopefully you understand your timeline. It's before the war started, but as things, as you probably, and this is a month after the invasion of Poland, and Roosevelt receives on his desk a letter signed by prominent scientists in living in the United States, including Albert Einstein, who's the big name on there, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller. And what they did was in this letter warn of Nazi atomic research that they know had been going on, and delivers to Roosevelt the idea that a big, huge, giant bomb with potential lots of energy being released from it that's unprecedented in the world could be used and developed. And so they wanted to let Roosevelt know that the Nazis were working on this and be made aware from this. Roosevelt, reading this letter, says, well, how can I act? Well, first thing before he does anything is to see if he can do that. So he creates an advisory committee on uranium to study the feasibility of building this atomic bomb. So what he does upon receiving this letter is try to sit down and figure out, can you build this bomb? Is it something that's worth our time or effort? So he begins to work on the theory of actually creating it by putting it in front of this committee. So again, some of the things that the scientists come up with are radar and sonar. They come up with DDT, a insecticide, in order to be able to kill insects to help Americans fight in and heavily protect us. And again, they're spraying not only American GIs with this, but also with refugees and with prisoners of war in order to be able to cut down on diseases like typhus or malaria, just two examples spread by insects from there. Thanks to other innovations like penicillin, by again, this is going to be able to help treat bacterial infections and be able to cut down on losses due to illness or um, all the different cuts and scrapes and other things that are going on from there. And we see again a big improvement in medical advancement for American servicemen in particular, and through, in generally most servicemen in World War II. The invention of the first computers, right, in order to be able to come up with calculations. One of the biggest supercomputers is be able to start working on the Manhattan Project with the atomic bomb to do those calculations. And again, some things that seem small, like the proximity burst shell, which you see pictured in front of you, have important things to do that way. So with the atomic bomb, the advisory committee comes back and says, if we start now, a bomb can be built within 3 to 5 years. And Roosevelt signs off on it and says, let's get started. And so with that, we see in 1942 the Manhattan Project beginning. Now, why it's called the Manhattan Project is because they had different parts of the United States was divided up into different military jurisdictions. And so this project was given to the jurisdiction of the Army in Manhattan. And so that's kind of just how it named it is. What it was the top secret atomic bomb construction program. The it was the program to build the atomic bomb. It was led by two people on the military side to be able to get all the different um, people and more importantly materials to the project was General Leslie Groves. And on the science part of it, the person that actually build the bomb, design it, and come up with it is J. Robert Oppenheimer. So those are the two guys who lead it on the military side of getting this stuff to the scientists and from the science side of putting it together from there. Over the course of the Manhattan Project, it's going to cost $2 billion in 1942 dollars. It's going to employ over 150,000 people across the United States, including a 59,000 acre site built overnight out of in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And that was for the extraction of the uranium 235 isotope. You can't just take uranium, put it into atomic bomb. You need a slightly unstable version of it. And so they needed to take the uranium, enrich it in order to be able to get to the specific uranium they want, 235. I mean, literally atom by atom, molecule by molecule to put it together. Scientific research led by Oppenheimer was done on top of a mesa in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to be able to go and actually figure out how to do that. And when they saw and came up with the idea that plutonium might actually be a quote unquote better way of building a bomb, they decided, well, instead of putting all our eggs in a uranium one or a plutonium one, let's just do both. And so plutonium extraction was done in a factory in Hanford, Washington. In order to be able to see again, or this another crucial step was the actual first nuclear reaction. And so the first time that nuclear fission was done outside of stars in the solar system was created in Chicago, Illinois, under research scientists led by Enrico Fermi. And he did this underneath the bleachers. This is not like underneath the bleachers, but like underground, underneath the bleachers of the old Chicago University football stadium in the middle of downtown Chicago, and that's the first time that a react controlled nuclear reaction was taking place. So important for one, a step to building the atomic bomb, and two, towards using the creation of nuclear energy that we'll see in the latter half of the 20th century. So again, we all across the United States, this is a truly continental wide project in order to be able to go and do this. Again, led on the left by Robert Oppenheimer and on the right by Leslie Groves. The first step was the pile, so-called what Fermi led again underneath the Chicago Stadium. And what you have is a whole bunch of carbon, like what you have in your pencil bricks, all around, again, a couple of um, uranium rods that, again, put close together, would start having their atoms react and split and cause electricity. Now, the scientists really didn't know what they had when they were putting this together, and so one science they're taking bets whether it was going to power like a light bulb, whether it was not going to work at all, or whether it was going to start a chain reaction to ignite every oxygen molecule on the planet and thus char the um, Earth into a big, huge, giant blackened ball of fire. And luckily for them, they were able to control it from there. In order to keep all that from happening, they had a bucket of sand and an axe to try to break it all apart. Don't worry, it's very safe. You can go see a example of this, a model in the Field Museum in Chicago, which I took a picture of right there, just to give you an idea of where the first nuclear reactions were taking place. Again, in the middle of one of the largest cities in the world. And again, if that goes off like an atomic bomb would have, it would have made changed, really altered the course of Chicago in probably a lot of different ways. Give you some teeny tiny small amount idea of just how big the Manhattan Project one. This is from the Hanford, Washington uh, factory, and so you can just start to see just some of the numbers from there. Again, some of the stuff that they're doing: 18,000 pork chops for one mess hall, 250,000 pounds of meat for all the mess halls for a week. What are the other ones? Like 600 gallons of ice cream a day. They need 250 cows to supply the milk for one breakfast. They're going through 700 cases of Coca-Cola, 30,000 donuts a day. They had an automatic donut machine making 18,000 donuts per hour. So it's just type of stuff from there where again, um, they're they're washing 1,780,000 sheets from there, and if tied together, they would reach from Hanford, Washington to New York City across from there. So again, that's just one small part of what's going on throughout this. So as the United States begins to turn towards putting on wood footing, the federal governments can take more control over the economy. And so we see economic controls placed on this, including the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. And what this tried to do is fight inflation with spending all this money on all these war things and putting all this more currency in there. They wanted to keep prices at the same point, so they froze them. And so Congress did this by raising and extending taxes, and they also encouraged the buying of war bonds, private citizens paying money to the United States, getting a certificate back that said, we owe you um, a certain amount of money, right, that can be redeemed, preferably by the government at the end of the war. But this gave much needed, one, cash to the government in order to be able to buy things like bullets, and more importantly, acted as almost a savings plan for Americans making a lot of money, right, in all of these different jobs that they're doing. We also see the creation of the War Production Board, the WPB, and this decided which countries should convert to war production, and they also allocated raw materials to key industries. You don't need to be like Mr. Cranmer's medieval costumers, right, and using up precious aluminum in your, I guess in this case, fancy like night costume. But again, that aluminum needs to go to the different war industries. And it's the War Production Board that decided you get this and you get that. They also help to organize drives to collect scrap iron, paper rags, and cooking fat to be able to recycling into different war materials to help with other things from there. The government also came up with a system of rationing, and this established a fixed allotment of war goods for people in the United States. And how this worked was each household would receive a coupon book, be able to say that you can have X amount of meat and X amount of butter and X amount of stuff from there to be able to ration all this other stuff. And America is going to be able to have a lot better wartime experience than a lot of other countries. And it's a major achievement for the United States to actually increase wartime production and consumer and consumption during the war, which is kind of unheard of and would surprise any of the other nations that are fighting in the war itself. Most Americans accepted all this stuff as trying to do their part to help out the war effort, so you don't really see a whole lot of griping or complaining. Everyone kind of just took it on the chin and went from there. So again, the ration books would be given out from there, and again, this is be able to try to ration important things from there and to keep hoarding and from other stuff from there. And so again, for things rationing like sugar, this is to be able to make cakes without with less flour or with less eggs or with other stuff from there. Uh, Gas rationing was also another thing, so that gasoline could go towards driving a tank in uh, France versus driving your car from one end of Iowa to the other end. And we even have things like speed limits being introduced a lot for the first time for the sole purpose of trying to save rubber and save gasoline in order to be able to go and do that. And so different things would be for different points. You have so many points to spend on your ration book. So it's kind of a lot of like what you see on like sports Twitter, where it says like, "What's your perfect NBA team?" and it gives you 20 different choices, and you only have 15 points to spend. And like LeBron and Michael Jordan are like 5 points each, and then like a terrible basketball player is worth 1 point, and you go and build your team and try to do it that way. So it's the basic idea from there. As again, you're going to the store, spending your ration books, coupons, just like you would money, to be able to help support the war effort as we go from there. Because again, the United States needs gasoline, it needs scrap rubber to make all this stuff, and kids would do their part with scrap iron drives, be able to go get old stuff from there, be able to help out and do their stuff. And again, whether it's led by Boy Scouts or other community activists, again, to be able to go and do your little parts with other things instead of it going to a trash heap or the dump, right? It's going to be recycled from there, including women doing their part, right, by going and marching down the street naked in a barrel, or by going and doing other clothing drives from there, including giving up shoes or other stuff from there to help stuff. And so women's fashion changes is according to this. We see a lot of moving, particularly in shoes, of cork shoes or other uh, footwear, so that again leather can be put towards the military, and again as women are having to do from this. And one of the kind of the big things that's different that you might not think about in a wartime setting is that women, a major fashion point would be not leaving the house without a pair of stockings on, kind of covering your legs from this, and a woman would not be caught dead without aside from there. But what are those stockings made out of silk? Well, particularly the nicer ones. Well, those are needed in the war industries, and so women would give up stockings, but you got to walk outside the house without you need that on your legs, and so they paint almost like a self tanner, and then because these would be how they're manufactured, sewed with a line down the back of them, they actually paint the line on there to make it appear as if they're still wearing their stockings. So again, just some of the more ingenious ways that women were trying to help out with the war effort as we begin to get into the actual fighting uh, coming up soon.